Good morning or afternoon or evening, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. And, it's my pleasure today to welcome Stephen Batchelor as well as Gil Fronsdal in a conversation. I imagine the conversation will touch on many topics, but one of the reasons that we're here today is that Stephen has a new book coming out next month, August 26th, I believe, called Buddha, Socrates, and Us, Ethical Living in Uncertain Times. I don't have a physical copy, but Stephen has one right there. So it'll be available wherever you purchase books, Amazon or your local bookshop, I hope. Believe there's a Kindle as well as an audiobook version, right? Right, Stephen?
Yeah, that's right. They'll all be coming out at the same time.
So I'll just start things off here. I was fortunate. Stephen sent me an advanced copy of the book, so I've had a chance to read it. I'd say it feels like a synthesis of many threads that you've been talking about and teaching about over the last several years. It's very wide ranging. It's part memoir, part account of your own path of practice, and also weaving together of the lives of the teachings of the Buddha, as well as Socrates, who, as you point out, were near contemporaries, but separated by thousands of miles in different cultures. But they also advocated similar teachings. And along the way, you really touch on a whole bunch of different things. Greek playwrights, later Buddhist and Greek thinkers, including Stoicism and Epicureanism, as well as many modern philosophers such as Nietzsche and Heidegger. I'd love for you to share more about the book, its central themes, and what moved you to write it.
I've been working on this book for a long time. I think I wrote some of it before COVID, which shows how long ago that was. So maybe 7 or 8 years I've been working on this book. And it started out really as an attempt to write a kind of account of my philosophical journey through Buddhism, starting with my Tibetan training and then going on into my study of the early canon particularly. But when COVID hit, I've suddenly found myself in this very blessed state where I had nothing to do for an unpredictable amount of time in the future. And that gave me the opportunity to turn my attention to a field I've been interested in for many years, which is ancient Greek philosophy. But until then, I'd focused almost entirely on what are called the Hellenistic philosophers, the Stoics, the Epicureans, and the Skeptics. And I'd done that because, like others in this field, there are obvious parallels and points of connection between those Hellenistic schools of thought and particularly early Buddhism and early Mahayana too, I guess, as well. But COVID allowed me the time and the space to then go deeper into the roots of Greek thought, and that was to start reading Plato, which, to my embarrassment, I hadn't really looked at much before. And through Plato, of course, you encounter the figure of Socrates. Recent scholarship in the Buddhist world, particularly by people like Richard Gombrich and Heinz Bechert, have fairly persuasively shown that the dating of the Buddha should be moved forward by about 80 years so that his dates would now be about 480 to about 400. That's the broadly accepted scholarly consensus, although that of course could change, and there are people who now challenge that as well. But the point is that that dating shifts the Buddha into almost the exact span of life that we know in the 5th century BC in Athens, with the birth and the death of Socrates. So the two men who arguably between them had comparable impact on the evolution of thought, spiritual practice in Asia, in the case of the Buddha, and the foundations really of Western philosophical thought and practice in the West. And I find it quite striking that these two men were walking the earth at probably the same time. They never met each other, and they almost certainly knew nothing whatsoever about each other, but they still inhabited the same world. So I thought I would include a chapter on Socrates as part of this book, and I soon discovered that a chapter would not do justice to this figure at all, and so that meant my book morphed into something else. It became, in a way, a Buddhist portrait of Socrates in some ways, an attempt to get a handle on this man and his thinking and his life and the world in which he lived, but to see it from a Buddhistic kind of perspective. And I imagine myself, or a hypothetical ancestor, being present in Athens at the time that Socrates was alive. It would have been possible, quite unlikely, but possible. And what was really the discovery, which was quite unexpected, was when I raised the question, well, how did the Greeks address the issue of suffering? Plato never talks about suffering. Greek philosophy rarely mentions it. And yet, of course, it's utterly central to the Buddhist tradition. And I won't go into any great detail on this, but it seems that the primary medium for engaging with suffering was through tragic and comic theatre. And it seems that Socrates had a very close connection to the playwright Euripides. The two of them were said to be bolted together by some ancient writers. So that became another thread in the book, not just the philosophical parallels and differences, but also the exploration of how to engage with dukkha, with suffering, human suffering, by means not of meditation or what we might consider to be, the recollections of suffering, the first noble truth and so on, but actually engaging with suffering via the medium of the performing arts. And that then creates the second thread of the book. And the third thread of the book is really, well, all this is very interesting, but what does it mean for us now? I mean, does this really still speak to our condition in 21st century California or Europe? That's a bigger question. I think it does. In fact, I would argue quite strongly that it does. But how to disentangle the core universal principles of either the Dharma or Socratic thought and translate that into ways of thinking, ways of behaving and living in a kind of world like the one we have today, which is so different from that of the 5th century BC in Greece or in India, requires a fair amount of thought, reflection, but also speculation, and also teasing out what might the possibilities be by bringing these two founding figures of global philosophy together and seeing how that union of those two people might provide us with some clues as to how to respond to the kind of crises the world faces today.
Would you like to start the conversation, Gil?
I'm happy to. I'm delighted to be here with Stephen, and I don't know how Stephen thinks of his relationship to the Insight community, but some of us, at least me, have kind of adopted Stephen as our elder philosopher, and I love his thinking and his honesty, his engagement with all this, and he's been a very important person for us and for me. I feel very appreciative of his way of thinking, his approach to Buddhism. So it's very nice. And the surprise in reading your new book, which I delighted in reading, it was kind of an adventure to go, and I was so surprised to have, the journey was so vast. I was so surprised. I don't know much about the Greek philosophers, but it was not just the Greek philosophers, it was even modern philosophers, and what you engaged in was so much fun going back and forth. One of the delights of it was that we seem to share a central focus on ethics. As I've studied the Pali Suttas, I've come to the conclusion that the whole, even though the word ethics doesn't seem to exist in Pali in the way that we think of it, it seems like it doesn't have to be, because the whole path, the whole orientation is ethical inside and out, all the way right up to enlightenment. And enlightenment itself is an ethical transformation, the way it's described. And so I was delighted that you were pulling this out and bringing this forth as well, and to see that in Socrates. And then near the end of the book, you talk about Socrates, someone complaining to Socrates that he didn't leave any teachings. And he said, my life is a teaching. I've been consistent throughout my life in how I lived. And that was, his ethical life, his behavior. That was what he had to teach. And that was just a delight to read. And maybe it's just a personal question that I'd like to ask you. See what you have to say. It has to do with your scholarly ancestors in Victorian England. When I was young, I read some of these early writers, Rice Davids and people like that, and who made the claim that the fact that the Buddhist teachings in the Pali Canon was very ethical, thoroughly ethical, and I dismissed them at that time. And now in my old age, I've come around and said that they were onto something. But I wonder, was their understanding of ethics different than what your understanding is? Is it has it over these 100 years plus, has our understanding of ethics changed from what the word meant in Victorian England?
Well, I really don't know, actually, to be honest about that. But I do share, as you have just shared, the increasing conviction that the Dharma is basically ethics all the way down. And I think the most succinct model of that is the Noble Eightfold Path. In other words, and I understand the Eightfold Path is, in a sense, what the whole practice is really leading to on every level. It's to engage with our existence on earth with the totality of our human faculties, and that the practice of the Dharma simply, well, from my perspective, cannot be reduced to being proficient in certain meditative skills and gaining certain deep jhanas or insights or into emptiness and so on. I mean, that's part of the story, obviously. But my fear is that what's happened to Buddhism over its history is it is tended to become more and more specialized in terms of epistemology, in ontology, the nature of reality, enormous amount of attention on meditation of different levels, and the whole understanding of freedom and nibbana and so on being absolutely tied in to those kinds of spiritual exercises. But my sense, when I go back to the earlier layers of the suttas, is that the Buddha is more concerned really with how we can lead a flourishing life. And that's kind of how I understand ethics now. Ethics I distinguish very clearly from morality. And morality I understand really as following precepts, which again, it's part of the picture, but it's, I think, reductive to think of ethics just as, taking precepts and following them, and the basic sort of legalistic framework of what's good and skillful, unskillful in traditional Buddhism. But ethics is really based on the idea of the cultivation of one's character as a human person. The word ethos in Greek means something like character. It's the kind of person you are. But as an ethical being, you're not just the person you are. You're not a fixed ego, as Buddhism will tell you, very clearly. But you are a work in progress. You are a life that's unfolding in relation to the world and to other people. And every moment that you have to make a choice, or you have to say something or do something, you're called upon to to ask yourself implicitly, what is the appropriate, skillful thing to do in this situation? And my understanding of meditation, of mindfulness, is very much about how that quality of mind, the still, clear, present mind, is not a goal in itself, but actually it is the best kind of mind we can aspire to if we want to make appropriate judgments. That doesn't mean we'll always get it right. We might make a judgment with all of our wisdom and our compassion and still make things worse. That's always the nature of ethics, is that it's a risk. There's no certainty involved. And this is why I emphasize in the book how what I'm presenting is an ethics of uncertainty. It's an ethics that is how do we live optimally in a radically uncertain, contingent, unpredictable world? And this, I feel, was also very much Socrates' approach. And he's understood in very early Greek tradition as being the first philosopher who took ethics as his sole concern. Earlier in his life, it appears that he may have studied what was called natural philosophy. In other words, trying to figure out what is the nature of the world. Is it fire or water or earth or whatever? And he abandoned all of that and instead took up the question of how do I lead a good life? And that, I feel, is exactly what the Buddha is also asking, although maybe not quite in those words. How do I lead a good life? How do I live a life in which my potentials can flourish as a human person? And not just individually, but ethics necessarily involves our relationship to others. In other words, ethics is always a practice that's embedded in relationship. It has an impact on other people. It requires that one's mindfulness, one's attention is just as much attuned to how others feel, how others are experiencing suffering, and how to respond appropriately to that. So in that sense, these two founding figures, if one accepts that they are in fact such, are both effectively coming back to the primacy of ethics. Now, how the Victorians in England understood ethics, I honestly don't know. It's not a field I'm familiar with. But I do find it striking that people like the Rice Davids and others did have a view which is not too far away from the one that I would also share now. Perhaps, Gil, you likewise seem to be on that page as well. So that's a very good connection to have.
So I want to ask you though about this word flourishing. And I was struck in your book. You talked about the ethics of Socrates, and some of those things I would think, from a Buddhist point of view, are not ethical that he did. His sense of duty and being a soldier and going to war and other things that he did, and so there are different ethical orientations or bases. So in his idea of flourishing, and your idea of the Buddha's teaching on flourishing, what is the reference point for making any ethical decision? Is there any reference point that reference orientation, or is there some reference that guides a person, or is it simply some personal idea of flourishing?
I don't think ethics can ever be purely one's own personal position on something. It's always embedded in a social framework. And I would say that the Greek understanding of ethics is rooted in the sense that all of the early Greek philosophers share, and that is of what they consider to be their primary virtues. There are usually 4 or 5: wisdom, courage, piety is one, sometimes reverence it's called. Sophrosine, which means something like mindfulness, but it's very difficult to translate. It's often translated as moderation, which I think is only part of it, really. It's self-control, I think, is perhaps the best sort of summing up of that. And so there is, Socrates didn't say, okay, these are the key virtues. Well, how do you live those out? No, they were already regarded in his society as virtues that all, clear-thinking people would naturally and quite organically recognize to be what constituted a good life. What Socrates is showing, though, is that we all have ideas about what these things are, but when you probe someone to find out, well, what really is courage or justice? Justice is another one, dike, which the Buddhists don't really have. But justice is very, very important for them. So ethics, thereby, at least in that Greek framing, would be basically, how do I lead a life that is founded upon the primary sense of the good? And in so doing, then one would understand that to be a kind of flourishing. Now, in the Buddhist tradition too, again, there are lots of sets of virtues. In fact, probably a lot more than you'll find in the Greek. And when the Abhidhamma came along, they categorized all these, and you're the 10 virtuous ones and the 20 bad ones and so forth and so on. And so you have a framework once again, and this framework was probably not totally invented by the Buddha, but that would have been the environment in his samana, his renunciant community of which he was a part, in the world in which he lived. You again, you get, sets of virtues, things that people intuitively feel to be good. And those are, of course, categorized. I break them down primarily into 32 virtues, although usually Buddhist tradition says 37, but let's not go there. I think 32 works rather better, frankly. And those 32 virtues are then, at least in the Savastivada tradition, which found its way into Tibet, those 32 virtues are correlated to what they call the four paths of practice, which to me overlap very tidily with the tasks that at the end of the Buddha's first discourse he encouraged needed to be practiced in relation to the Four Noble Truths. So I feel there is a framework there, to be quite honest, I think a rather more sophisticated framework than we find in the simple list of 4 or 5 virtues that underpins the Greek understanding of ethics. But if we think of, as I do, the path culminates in the Eightfold Path, as it were. It starts with embracing suffering, letting reactive patterns just be, let them go, allowing oneself to settle in a non-reactive space of awareness and attention. And that then I understand to be the foundation for then being able to make more appropriate judgments in how we respond rather than simply react to the world that we encounter. And so flourishing, you find the Greeks have this word eudaimonia, which is to lead a good or blessed or happy life, but scholars nowadays rather prefer to use this word human flourishing. And that fits very well with a secular take on Buddhism, where the Eightfold Path becomes the framework for human flourishing. We flourish through how we think and how we imagine and how we work and how we speak. And it's all of these things. It's not just mindfulness and samadhi at all. It's this eightfold integral framework for living that, to me, it serves much the same purpose as the primary virtues in Greek thought. And you're going back to your earlier point, though. Yeah, there's many things that, Socrates was a soldier, a foot soldier. And I opened the account of Socrates precisely to give Buddhists a bit of a shock, because it's not what you'd expect. I think a lot of, I wasn't really aware of that at all until I started delving into Plato. And then when you line up the battles that Socrates was fighting in with the plays that were then being performed when they came back from the battle, you really see that he was leading a life that would have been quite incoherent for the Buddha, I think, for a Buddhist practitioner. In the same way that for the Buddhists, Socrates' life would have been very difficult to comprehend as a spiritual practice. And for example, well, on two fronts, basically, the Greeks and the Buddhists differed on sex and violence. The Greeks saw it as a duty, whoever you were in the society, to protect the city, to have, and your family and your society. And the Buddhists, at least those who were part of the monastic community, they withdrew from all that activity. There are points of parallel. Socrates did not engage in the politics of his time, except towards the very end of his life. Once or twice he did. But broadly speaking, he renounced that level of engagement with the world. He didn't attend the assemblies. He wasn't part of the democratic process. He saw himself as a gadfly. To wake up the slumbering souls of Athens. And again, you get the image again of awakening, waking people up, getting them to think for themselves, getting them to take responsibility for their lives, getting them to think. And I think that mirrors, in some ways, the Buddha's own approach as a dialogical teacher. Someone who didn't just come and stand on a platform and say, well, this is reality, this is the truth, I understand it, now you just listen to this and shut up. No, so much of the Pali Canon is dialogic. It's the Buddha exchanging with people, from all walks of life as well. The trouble is we don't have in the Buddhist canon such a reliable record of what he said compared to what we find in Plato and in the playwrights and in Xenophon and Thucydides and so on. And that's, that in a way is perhaps a weakness. The Buddha comes across as he has far less personality, as it were. He's often just he's just a mouthpiece for his doctrines and teachings and so on. You get a much more granular and vivid picture of Socrates and his circle, which has been lost in the Buddhist tradition. But I think by putting the two together, especially since they're living at the same time, you can somehow borrow or reflect the Buddha's teaching and his life against the counter image of what was going on in Athens, about which we know so much, and about the Buddha's lifetime, particularly the lives of his lay followers. We know very little at all. And I imagine, again, this could be my fantasy, but that there was a vital Buddhist community emerging, not just in the Jeta's Grove and in the monasteries, but amongst the people living in the world, his lay followers. And there are passages in the suttas where he praises his lay followers and enumerates some of them, but you don't really know exactly what their lives were like. And whereas with Socrates, it's kind of the opposite. You've got a very, very, very detailed and vivid picture of the world in which he worked and lived.
Great. Yeah, I mean, we don't know much about the lay Buddhists, but we have enough evidence to know that lay Buddhists didn't take ethics as seriously as the Buddha expected the monastics to take it.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I don't know. I mean, there are, basically we don't know. But there is a passage in the Anguttara that I've always found very helpful. It's only a few sentences. It occurs in a sequence of suttas. I forget exactly where. I think it's in the sixes somewhere, which he lists and names 19 or 20 lay followers, householders, he calls them, Gahapati. But when he describes them, the language he uses is very close to the language he uses to describe the senior monks. And that passage is, I don't know whether you're familiar with that passage. I quote it a few times in the book or refer to it. But it opens up a glimpse that there were figures in the Buddha's time who were working as government officials, or they were working as business people, many different walks of life, doctors and so on, who the Buddha described as people who went about in their lives from the perspective of the deathless, he says. In other words, and he says they've achieved noble liberation, three things: noble wisdom, noble liberation, and noble something else, which is a phrasing that is uncommon when applied to lay people. And one has to ask, well, since it was the monastics who preserved these teachings, without the efforts of those people, those men and women, we wouldn't have Buddhism at all. And so clearly the monastic community is absolutely central to sustaining the tradition, but it also sustained it in ways that were primarily, and perhaps more and more, the preserve of monastic life. And so the lay society, I get the sense, it became more and more, as it were, distant from the center of the Buddhist active community. But again, once we go past the suttas into the early centuries of Buddhism in India and in China, you get even less sense of what these lay communities were like. We just don't have a clue. There was nothing written down, as I'm aware of. There was no record, really, of how these people lived. We have no idea what a little township in the northeast of India that was following the teachings of the Buddha, how the people would have led their lives. Did they go to theatre? Did they write plays? We just don't know. The only reason we know that they did is because monks were forbidden to attend them. And so it's difficult to say. I'm not willing to really make hard and fast judgments on the basis of the paucity of materials that we have to make them on. So I have to sort of leave that open as a question. But I think the real question for me, rather, is, well, if I'm inspired by Socrates, which I am, I think his life is an extraordinary life of incredible integrity. Whether I would become a foot soldier in his wake, I don't think so. But given the conditions under which he lived, given the values of that society, I don't feel that to be a problem, to be quite honest. And yet, on the other hand, if you look at how Buddhist traditions have dealt with war and violence, I don't see a terribly good track record there either. And one of the issues that's probably on people's minds as I speak is the conflict in Gaza, Ukraine. And the Buddhist, it's very difficult, I think, for Buddhists to really have a clear view as to how to respond to that, apart from simplistically saying, well, we should love and have compassion for people who suffer and we should avoid violence. That's about it. And that's fine in principle, but it doesn't actually translate very easily into concrete advice for somebody living in Israel today, for example. So I think Buddhism, in some ways, because it has been so centrally monastic, it's never really had to engage questions like just war theory, for example. When is violence, legitimate? And yet and take Burma today, Sri Lanka, just recently, Burma and Sri Lanka are good examples. Here we have Theravada Buddhist countries, which are, with populations of many monks and religious figures committed to these teachings. And yet when, you get a minority group like the Rohingyas or the Tamils coming down to the north of Sri Lanka, the reaction of these Buddhists is just the same. They pick up their weapons and they wipe out the people they see as standing in the way of their own flourishing. I don't see. I feel very, very disappointed in many ways by how Buddhist countries actually work in the frame of violence. The monks don't seem to encourage them to be non-violent and to not fight. You look at Japan during the war, Zen at War by Brian Victorious, paints a very, very clear picture of how the Japanese monks and priests were fully on board with the war. In Korea too, same. So in some ways, I think, there's a weakness in Buddhism in that it doesn't and it hasn't addressed the questions of war and violence in the ways in which, say, the Greek philosophers did, or even later in Christian and Islamic theories of just war.
Yeah, this is true. And but what you just said now was kind of to a point that I want to address. You said the Sri Lankans attacked the immigrants because they were challenging their own flourishing. And so when flourishing is the reference point, it's easy to reify flourishing. It's easy to reify the virtues that are associated with flourishing. And so when I read your book, I felt that there was a big difference between an ethics of flourishing, which seems to be what you were championing, and what I see in the early Pali Canon. It's the ethic of non-harming is at the center of it. And the ethics of non-harming is different than the ethics of flourishing. And I agree that you find flourishing emphasized by the Buddha. The Pali word is vipula, probably closest to it, and that he encourages people to flourish, to become abundant in these qualities, wholesome qualities. But I see that non-harming is at the center.
Well, that was how I was taught. I mean, that I think is the traditional view. But non-harming, I've always had a problem with non-harming because, I mean, how do you know that what you're going to do is not going to harm? I mean, that's the whole problem with ethics, is that it's all very well in certain clear-cut cases.
Yeah.
If you're, if for example, someone is I can't even think of a good example. My mind is gone all foggy. But the point is that, you can follow all the precepts. And you don't kill, you don't steal, you don't abuse people, and so on and so forth. And that works probably pretty well most of the time as a kind of rule of thumb. But the trouble with ethics and morality, if we bundle them together, is that the real ethical and moral dilemmas we face are precisely those things that don't have clear-cut solutions. Like, how do you respond to this crisis in Gaza, for example? Or how do you deal with the question of abortion in the case of a woman who would otherwise die if she did not be aborted? All those kinds of blurry, fuzzy issues that I think are absolutely central to our ability to think and to struggle with ethics. These do not lend themselves to a generalized principle like not harming. What does not harming mean in these cases? And how do you know that what you will do will not actually lead to a situation that's far worse in the future? We don't know. So I don't think, I mean, I think non-harm, of course, I don't want to harm anybody, and I probably imagine that's true with most people, and I do my best to avoid it, and I do my best to understand what is it that I might do that could cause harm. But you also have situations where sometimes you do need to cause harm. For example, if you're a parent and you have a child who's very unruly, you may need to discipline them in some way. You may need to cause them some kind of harm. Forbid them from, ground them, I think is the word used, and stuff like that, which the kid hates. So where does harm is gets a bit foggy, I find. Very difficult to pin down, and I think quite difficult to make a basis for ethics, but possibly no more difficult than what flourishing means also. That's also a bit fuzzy once you start, prodding it a bit. And what does it mean to lead a fulfilled life? I mean, this is what I so much like about Socrates in his dialogues with people he accosts on the street sometimes, is that he takes their assumptions, okay, let's say non-harming, and he'll really then probe into that. He'll really push that idea. What do you mean by non-harming? What does it mean to not cause harm? I mean, what about this case? What about the other case? He will push it. Instead of leaving it as just a kind of a generic idea that seems like a good thing. And I find that kind of critical ethical inquiry, you don't find so much in Buddhism. And I think partly this probably has to do with the doctrine of karma, that there are certain actions which are going to get, if you kill, you're going to get reborn in a hell or something. And that kind of legalistic calculation as to I don't do this thing because if I do it, I'll go to some nasty, realm in the next life. I mean, that may be true. I have no idea. But frankly, it doesn't seem to be an approach that will really force you to engage with the immediacy of the suffering in the particular situation you find yourself. And what I like about a lot of the Mahayana ethics, particularly as you find, say, in Shantideva, is that the Bodhisattva vow overrides the Vinaya and the other vows that you may have taken as a monk or a layperson. If the virtue of compassion is primary in a particular instance, then that should be followed, and the other ethical or moral precepts can be left behind. And that, I think, points to what in the West we would call a situational ethic. And situational ethics is something I first came across in writings of Christian theologians. And I find it a very helpful way to understand the ethics of Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism is actually going beyond legalism. It's just a bunch of rules. It's basing one's ethics in terms of how you respond with compassion and with love and with the bodhicitta, with this aspiration to become awake for the sake of others. How do those principles inform your response to a particular situation in your life? And there you're no longer beholden to the strict rules.
Well, I've seen people operating under what I think is genuine compassion, but in doing so, they're blind to the effect they have. They're blind to the effect it has on themselves. But compassion by itself is not a very good ethical guideline.
No, I agree. It's not. You need, and that's I think why perhaps the Greeks and the Buddhists there's a suspicion, I think, of laying the whole of ethics on one particular virtue. But but rather there are sets of virtues, whether it's the 5 virtues in Greek or whether it's the 10 virtuous actions in the Abhidharma or whatever it is. Virtues always operate as team players in a set of different skills and virtues.
Maybe, but the things that inspire me the most in the Pali Suttas about ethics are the situational, the kind of situational ethics of the Buddha, where he doesn't offer answers. He offers guidelines for how to find an answer.
Yeah, right.
And
No, I
the,
agree.
and the simplest one that is where he has all kinds of things that he says, including the development of a sense of self. Because I don't tell people not to develop a sense of self. I tell people that if the developing a sense of self helps one to have more wholesome qualities, then develop that. But if it's unwholesome, don't develop that. So there's a reference point of what is wholesome and unwholesome.
No, I completely agree. I've always felt that the self is over-negated in Buddhism. Whereas you find many passages in the sutras, and the famous passage towards the end of the Buddha's life, where he says your atta, your self should be your refuge. This usually is muddied in English by saying be a refuge unto yourself in this rather clumsy old Victorian type English, but basically saying, you, yourself, the person, you need to be responsible for your own lives. When the chips are down, well, it's not just the atta, it's not just the self, it's the dhamma as well, because both are considered to be islands and refuges. And they're also considered to be your only island, your only refuge. So I understand that as meaning that the dhamma that you have integrated into yourself and somehow has formed and shaped you. Again, there are passages.
In that famous passage you just quoted, he goes on to explain how to do that. And it's developing mindfulness.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah.
And I somehow I have this sense that the greater that attentiveness to oneself, mindfulness of the body, mind, dhammas, all these things, creates a greater sensitivity to what causes harm and what doesn't cause harm.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And it's heightened, this capacity for heightened sensitivity to that, I think, is one of the hallmarks of this Buddhist practice.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. But I would still argue, whoops, a heart floating up the screen. But nonetheless, I mean, that may be the case in immediate situations. But I mean, a lot of the harm that's being caused in the world today is not going to affect us. It's going to affect future generations.
Yeah.
In the climate crisis, for example. And we assume it'll cause harm. We don't really know. But yeah, I just find it a weak word, harm. I accept it as you describe it. It sounds okay. But it's not, as you'll note in my book, I don't think I hardly ever use that expression. I don't use that word at all. I'm very keen on the word care, which is how I translate appamada. And that I think is quite central to how I conceive of ethics in a Buddhist sense. The Buddha describes care, or sometimes translates diligence, which I think is too weak. But however we translate it, it's basically, and it's described by the Buddha as the elephant's footprint. In other words, it's the virtue that includes all other virtues. And I think, of course, the Buddha's supposed very last words were to tread the path with appamada, with this kind of caring attention. We could translate it that way. And that, I think, is really an overarching sensibility, as you put it, a sensibility that is more and more alert and attuned to whatever reactions and impulses are rising up in your own mind. It's as the mind gets stiller and quieter and more present, you begin to read situations more clearly. You get a much more clear, empathetic sense of where a particular person might be coming from or what they may be suffering, even though you may not understand exactly, but you sensitize yourself to all these things. And it's that sensitivity that informs your practice of of care for yourself, care for others, care for the world. And of course, if you care for something, you don't want them to suffer. You don't want them to be harmed in any way. And so that would be a necessary outcome of care. But to me, to care in that way is prior to the wish not to harm. I think the wish not to harm is really a consequence of a heartfelt care for oneself, for others, for the world,
Yeah.
both here and now in this life, and also in terms of the consequences that our actions will lead to after we're dead.
This is great to hear from you. Thank you, Stephen. And I also have come to this idea that care is at the heart of this whole enterprise. And part of the challenge with these kind of conversations is that maybe the human being is an ecosystem. And so we can't really pull one thing out and give it too much priority without the others being right there, necessary pieces of that whole. But in now caring for all these people, the community that came to join and hear you, I bet they would like to ask you questions and have the chance to engage. So I think maybe time for that.
Sounds like a good moment. Yeah, let's do that. So
why don't we have people raise their hands so there's some degree of order, and we'll try to get to as many as that we can with the time that we have available. Why don't we start with Cody?
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for your talk. So I'm just finishing up a book that was recently released by Mel Weitzman and the Green Gulch Abbot, and it's talks of Suzuki Roshi, and the book mainly focuses on Zen ethics and precepts. And in one of the chapters, one of these are all talks. He talks about the precepts are like having a hat on your head that you sometimes forget about, and also talks about how the precepts are not to be taken as commandments, and I got the sense, kind of how the two of you were talking, it's the type of thing where you it's something you refine over time, your understanding of ethics, and it's that process is facilitated by awareness first and foremost. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on how your ideas in your book compare to those Zen concepts, especially Suzuki Roshi's concepts of precepts, and how that might compare to your ethics.
Well, I'm not having read the book you've mentioned, and not having read books by Suzuki Roshi for a very long time. I can't really answer that with much clarity. Maybe Gil could focus on that. My sense, though, broadly speaking, in Buddhist communities, in, let's say, Zen communities more generally, is that there is there's much greater emphasis on morality than ethics, in the way I would understand it. Precepts for me are moral precepts. They're basically, guidelines, if you like. But although actually, if you look at the Pali text, it actually sees them as trainings. I think that's something that often gets overlooked. Precepts are trainings, they're practices. They're not things that you say, I will not kill anymore, full stop. You will say, I will lead a life, I will train myself to lead a life in which I do not end up killing people. And that makes it more of a practice than just a rule to follow. And in that sense, it's closer to what I would understand by the practice of ethics. Ethics is a practice just as much as meditation is a practice. And the two support each other. The Sila Samadhi Panya model, ethics, contemplation, and wisdom, is, I think, again, a model which, again, my Zen teacher in Korea, that was very central to his teaching. It was to harmonize these three principles, and to make ethics part of your contemplative practice, and also a necessary condition for the emergence of a deeper kind of wisdom and understanding as well. So that's really all I can say about that. I mean, Gil, you would be more familiar, I think, with the work of Shunryu Suzuki. Is that not correct? I mean, Didn't you study with him, or did you meet him? Or
No, I never met him, but I practiced at his center for years. I'm happy with your answer. I'm happy to leave it that way. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Stephen, Gil, Rob, thank you so much. This is a wonderful conversation. Two things. One, I started out kind of in the secular spaces and moved the last 3 years into inhabiting monastic spaces. And it's been really amazing change for my practice to keep 5 precepts for the last 2.5 years. Even though I wasn't much of a drinker, for example, before, not having it at all is really like a helpful mindfulness kind of tool. But also like dāna has become a central part of my day-to-day life and practice in terms of, not necessarily money, because I don't have money right now, but giving, just the awareness that, I need to not harm makes me stop and say, okay, how do I respond in this situation where I'm feeling some tension? And maybe I can even catch myself feeling the tension and relax it before responding. I even do some renunciation, which I found really helpful. So for me, it's actually been really helpful to, and like you said, like a training. It's more like a training. It felt like that. But I see both sides, like, and lots of room for people on all ends of the spectrum of secular versus more religious, for lack of a better term. And then I had a question about, have you seen Ajahn Sona's recent documentary on how he says the Greeks were in India during the time of the Buddha? And because there's so much overlap between the philosophies, I was wondering if, did you find that in your research as well, that there was some intermingling of the India and the Greeks? Thank you.
Well, yes and no. There was certainly intermingling between Buddhists and Greeks from about the time of Alexander the Great, which is, he arrived in India in the end of the 4th century BC, so about 325 BC. But the Buddha's, but I think there's no evidence whatsoever that Greeks would have been in the parts of India where the Buddha was while the Buddha was alive. The main source we have on that is Herodotus, who was a contemporary of Socrates, and he was a historian. And he has a good knowledge of, and he describes the world of his time. He gives a very, very detailed account of Persia and Egypt and as far as Afghanistan and the Indus Valley area. But beyond that, he knows nothing. And that's where the Buddha would have been. It's very unlikely that during the Buddha's lifetime, any of his followers would have made it as far west as, say, Gandhara, what is now Pakistan. So I think there's very, very little possibility that the ideas of the Buddha would have in any way have come across to Socrates and vice versa. We just don't have the evidence to support that. There are, however, and I do cover this in the book in actually quite some detail, increasing interactions between Buddhists and Greek settlers after Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire. And you get in northwest India, particularly, you have lots of Greek remains there even today, and you have a famous text in Pali, the Questions of King Milinda or Mananda, which is a hypothetical dialogue between a Greek king in that part of India with a Buddhist monk called Nagasena, and other fragments, a famous one being of the skeptic Pyrrho, the founder of the skeptical movement, who went to India with Alexander, and in Greek records is said to have studied with Indian sages. So from that period, I think there is a case to be made. There is a vague hint that the philosopher Democritus, who was a contemporary of Socrates but not from Athens, that he may have got as far as India, but that's a very, very that's somewhat speculative. But it is mentioned in the Greek histories. So I think the main points of contact occur in the centuries following the deaths of the Buddha and Socrates. And there I think there was actually quite a lot of interaction. One might even begin to speak of a kind of Helleno-Buddhist culture that extended from Afghanistan, Pakistan, through the countries of Central Asia and perhaps further into India as well. We know there's a famous temple in Maharashtra called Karla, which was built around the 1st century AD, and 3 of its sponsors were Greeks. That's one of the few bits of hard information we have because it's chipped into the rock. So I think there was a lot of interaction going on, but very few records of what that might have been. But I find it quite intriguing to follow some of those lines of thought, but with the caveat that one must be careful of reading too much into what is actually quite meager evidence.
Yes, hello, thank you so much. That was really interesting. And also just a comment, I am really grateful for you pointing out the difficulty sometimes of Buddhist ethics, in operationalizing Buddhist ethics for moral dilemmas. I'd be really curious as to how to move forward from that. But my question is more imaginative. If the Buddha and Socrates were to have met, what would they have discussed? What questions would they have asked each other? Sorry to put you on the spot. That's quite a hard question on the
It's a very
spot.
good question, actually. And it is hypothetically possible. To be quite honest, I don't know. Your question has stumped me a bit. Nothing springs to mind. I imagine they would have embarked on a conversation. I don't think either of them would have been the passive partner to such a discussion. It could have been, arguably, they might have had one of the most fruitful conversations that humankind had ever had. But maybe they wouldn't have got each other at all. That's also possible. I mean, perhaps on the grounds that Gil suggested, that the Buddha would not have been terribly impressed with a lay person who fought as a soldier and was very openly attracted to young men. That wouldn't have maybe sat so well with the Buddha. I don't know. No idea. And Socrates might have thought of the Buddha as I think it would be very difficult for the Greeks to have actually understood the Indian renunciant tradition. It was so alien to them. You have no examples of comparable figures leaving the world and going off and meditating in a cave. You get that a bit with Democritus, but otherwise, no. They were wired quite differently in many ways in how they thought about the world. It's a good question, but I'm afraid a lousy answer.
You did great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for this fascinating discussion. I really look forward to reading the book. I find myself, I'm in an interfaith sort of world, and I'm finding that many sort of hardcore atheists who practice many Buddhist practices, so the secular Buddhists, if you will, and then of course the secular mindful movement, which is psychology, modern psychology. That strangely enough, that it seems every now and then, it's like there's a need for some kind of spiritual foundation, and I've noticed lately a rise in what I would consider animism, and even in Buddhism itself, in Western Buddhism, a strange like an aversion to any kind of actual spirituality, except that, on the other hand, an embrace of all the the realms and the devas and the spirits and which I see as a kind of almost animism. And so I would love to hear you comment on that, because even in ancient Greece, of course, there was a great spectrum of beliefs, and a lot of the Greek philosophers rejected the pantheon of the Greek gods in favor of a more I would call it a more maybe mystic interior spirituality that was more rationally based. So but I'm seeing that now too in our modern day world with all of our science and technology. And for me, it's kind of mystifying. So I'd love to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Okay. I'm aware there's quite a number of hands up, so I'm going to try and make my answers as succinct as possible. I have a problem with the word spirituality. I'm not quite sure what it means. But I do recognize what you're saying is that if in this more secular side of contemporary Buddhism or mindfulness and so on, there is a danger, I think, that it becomes a bit dry and overly rational and too schematic, perhaps. And people are drawn, I think, also through, as one's meditation practice becomes more mature and maybe more integrated and embodied, I think it does open up a sensibility, intuitions that somehow question the voice of the strictly rational mind. And I'm aware that a number of people I know, including myself, have recently been exploring plant medicines with shamans from South America and Mexico and so on. In other words, as a way to somehow connect with a spirituality, if we use that word, that's not contained within an organized religion, but is actually opening up to a dimension of life that organized religion, almost by definition, tends to strangle in some way. And that was the case with the Greeks. I mean, you correctly point out that the Greek philosophical tradition didn't concern itself with religious issues at all. But most of the Greek philosophers, as far as we know, would have belonged to one of the mystery cults, like Orpheus or the Mithras, or these different secret meetings about which we know very, very little, because they kept these meetings secret. They were private occasions where men and women would engage in practices about which we don't know anything. You get a hint of this if you read Euripides' play The Bacchae, Ecstatic Women, where you actually have a bacchanalian element in the play itself, which is very much about a radical embrace and participation in the raw, natural energy of the world itself. And this, I think, is also what gets opened up in some of these shamanic ceremonies that you might participate in. It's about, in a way, temporarily suspending some of the safety mechanisms of our rational mind and allowing ourselves to open up to the raw, unstructured wonder of being alive at all. And I think at that point, we also tap into deeper contemplative experiences too, say in the jhanas or in other practices, whereby likewise you put aside the overly conceptual, rational parts in order to connect more bodily and emotionally with the sheer mystery and wonder of life itself. So I'm very much on board with that. But how exactly we integrate all this is a bit of a bigger question.
Indeed. Thank you.
So earlier in the conversation, it was clear that ethics, being ethical, is central to living a flourishing life. And then Gil asked, what's the reference point for ethics?
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of took away, it depends on the society and time that you live in.
Mm-hmm.
There were a different set of ethics for Socrates' time and place and Buddha's time and place. Mm-hmm. But what about me here and now? Am I to choose a set of ethics that just seems right to me? Or should I kind of know, should I have an ethical sense that comes from my place and time and follow those ethics to be flourishing? Or should I place my confidence in those that have followed the Dharma and seem to be living a flourishing life and follow those ethics? That's my question.
Well, thank you, Darrell. It's a very good question. And I think it's impossible to grow up in any society without inheriting a set of ethical norms and values that you just take as being given. And even though I consider myself a Buddhist, I'm fully aware that many of my deeper moral intuitions are probably more Christian than Buddhist, in fact. And I don't think there's any way we can dispel that. I don't think becoming a Buddhist means you sort of cancel out everything that's gone before in terms of your ethical upbringing. If you look at how Buddhism went to China, for example, it took on a Chinese ethical character, which was informed by Taoism and its relationship to nature, Confucianism and its valuing of maintaining harmony within a society. Buddhism comes along and it fits into that ethical frame, I think, very successfully. And that continues right up until today. But I also recognize, and again, I see this very much in my own case, is that by the time I got to be about 18 or 19 years old, I really didn't feel my life had any orientation or bearings at all, or if they, or at least I wasn't conscious of them. And I'd been excluded from the church. My family was not church going. I had no religious upbringing at all. And I felt by the time I got to be a young adult that something was missing. So I couldn't have put a label on it then, and I almost certainly wouldn't have called it ethics, but something. It was not really a need was not being met. And that's what led me into Buddhism. Quite clearly, that was, and many of my friends who ended up in India in those days too, we were looking for something. And that implies that there was something in our lives that had not been adequately provided in our upbringing, our whole generation. And you may feel like that too. So you do get to a point in one's life, I did certainly, where I had to consciously say, okay, what would be the best way to live? And I was fortunate in studying with Tibetan lamas who taught a body of teachings called the Lam Rim, the Stages on the Path. It's a literature that just, lays out, at least from the Tibetan Buddhist point of view, what are the main stages of the path that lead you to being awake. And when I look back on that now, I see it really as a course in practical ethics. We were invited to question what our motivations were, what it was that we aspired to become, what sort of person we wanted to be. Those are, to me, the core ethical questions. And I think I found it very valuable, actually, to have to somehow think that out from scratch. It wasn't something I was being taught at Sunday school or in my local church. This was coming from a culture completely different from the one in which I had grown up, and yet they were offering a vision of how to lead a fully realized human life in a set of terms quite alien to my own upbringing, and that perhaps allowed a certain clarity, a certain freshness that allowed us to see those things in a way that perhaps traditional Buddhists have become blind to, in the way that we are often blinded by the things that are closest to us. Christianity, I was very blinded to that because it was so much in my face. Buddhism, I think, has given me both the distance to reassess my own ethical past and upbringing, and certainly not to sort of reject it, but actually to value many of the impulses and intuitions that I was raised with. It's led me to appreciate more the Christian tradition in particular, the Jewish tradition likewise. But the Buddhist framework, for me at least, seems to be the one that is the most comprehensive on the one hand, and on the other hand, offers a very practical, structured set of guidelines whereby you can actually bring these virtues into your life and cultivate and realize them through your interactions with your society and world.
Thank you.
First of all, I totally appreciate your willingness to talk about the ambiguity that is in everybody's experience almost all the time. I have a couple of questions. One is, have you read Agnes Callard's book, Open Socrates? And the other is when you talk about struggling or learning more about your own ethical position in the world, has that continued as you've gotten older? Because I live in a community where everybody is getting close to 80 or over 80. And I'm very interested in how human development and the question of ethics go hand in hand.
Okay. Well, I have read the book by Agnes Callard called Open Socrates, or to be totally honest, I've read about half of it. I got bogged down in some of I've really enjoyed the first half of the book because she actually does take on very much the challenge of living a life in the way that Socrates seemed to encourage. For her, it's a practice. I enjoyed that. I found that very refreshing and very exciting. But then she got bogged down, or I felt she got bogged down in Meno's paradox and More's paradox and these rather abstract ethical reflections that I found it difficult to maintain much interest in, and I moved on to another book. As to the question of aging, I find as I get older, I find two things. One is that I recognize how I have learned to trust certain values, certain ways of doing things, certain ideas, certain perspectives, because they have actually, over the last 50 years, and I've been doing this for that long now, is that they've actually somehow borne fruit. They've actually somehow, justified themselves. And I find that very reassuring and very grounding. But at the same time, I also find that having that groundedness and perhaps a greater stillness and clarity in my mind, that these larger questions of how to develop as a human being and how to practice ethics, if anything, they become more puzzling, not less puzzling. To me, how to live is a question I think we'll continue asking no matter how long we live. And I'd be very suspicious of anybody who says, yeah, I figured all this out, I'm enlightened, and I'll tell you what to do. I find that sort of scenario one that I avoid quite scrupulously. I'm not looking for a religious or a spiritual or a philosophical authority. I don't think I really ever have, but I'm seeking a way of life that can, over time, enable me to make more appropriate judgments in terms of what I say and do, how I live. And I think that'll be an ongoing, practice until, either my brain gives up functioning properly or I die.
Stephen and Gil, thank you so much. I feel like a lot of this has been fairly conceptual, and where my head goes is, how do I use this? What does this look like in my life? Like, where does the rubber meet the road? And I'm just wondering, Stephen, if you could offer a reflection on how this deep dive into what's the best way to live, like how has this informed the life that you live? And I feel like you were just speaking to that, but I'm curious to hear you speak more about it.
Okay. Well, for me, what has turned out to be the very core practice of my life has been that of a writer and an artist. In other words, my practice lies not in meditating every day, which I do, and I value that enormously. But what the meditation practice has allowed me to do is to really tap into my own deepest intuitions, or it's not even that really. It's really about what meditation has done for me is that it has activated my imagination, but not in a way that's all sort of chaotic and all over the place, but actually it's provided a framework within which to channel and focus my imagination. And that takes concrete form in writing. I see myself as a writer more than as a Buddhist teacher, to be honest. Writing is for me a vocation. And ever since I started translating Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatara back in 1974, I have had a book on the go. In other words, I'm always in a process of writing. I'm in a bit of a gap at the moment, but that won't last long. And I fill that up by making collage. I'm working on an art piece at the moment. And that to me is incredibly important to how I live. And it's incredibly important in that learning to trust and follow that flow experience, that deep inner movement of life is what I now recognize quite unconditionally to be what will lead me to the next project. And it's those projects, that work that I'm engaged in that I find gives my life its central sense of meaning and purpose.
Hello. In your former books, you were mentioning often philosophers and thinkers of our time now. Are there any in your new book also?
Of thinkers currently alive?
Yes. No, maybe not. Heidegger forever is dead.
The thinkers, Danke, Konrad, it's very nice to see you here. The figure who I refer to the most amongst 20th century thinkers is Hannah Arendt. And that is perhaps a slightly surprising inclusion that she takes up quite a bit of the latter part of the book, partly because she was a very important student of Heidegger, who I've referred to quite a lot in my previous books, and also he gets a look in this one as well, and Nietzsche also. But where I've landed with this book is really with the work of Arendt, and primarily because she's someone who struggles with the question of ethics, and she's someone who also is passionately concerned as to how we govern ourselves politically. She doesn't really come up with any grand political theories at all, but what I like about her work is that you can somehow join her in her own attempts to somehow grapple with the question of how do we lead a life as a human community, societies, in a world with others. How can we optimize our capacity to be actively engaged in the societies in which we live? It's also interesting that Arendt, in an essay that was not published in her life, simply called Socrates, did in fact draw a great deal of her inspiration in her thinking from the figure of Socrates himself. And she also spends a lot of time working with the Greek paradigm of the contemplative life and the active life, or the political life and the life of thought. And I found that very helpful too. And in fact, towards the end of the book that I've just written, I reframe the Eightfold Path in the terms that she uses of the contemplative dimension of one's life and the active dimension of one's life. It's somewhat similar to the Buddhist idea of wisdom and means, a skill in means and wisdom. But I find that her thinking about this has been very helpful in enabling me to also find a way through this material, the Buddhists and the Greeks. And perhaps one of the other most important things about Arendt is she was totally uninterested in Buddhism.
Yes.
And I think that's actually a good thing, frankly. I think Heidegger was probably too interested in Buddhism to the extent that he tried to sort of disguise that quite a bit. But I think Arendt, for whatever reasons, provides a clarity in her thinking about these issues, and in a way that I found quite fruitful.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Thanks so much for the talk. I'm curious, Stephen, about something you said at the beginning about the fact that Buddhism, you have a lot of discussion about suffering, but I hadn't thought about this before. In the dialogues, Socrates says so little about suffering. And I guess you make something of this, you talk about this more in your book. And you also said, you know, despite Socrates' silence about suffering, at the same time, culturally, the Greeks are very much engaged with it through the tragic works.
That's right, yeah.
I just wanted to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about that. I mean, I'm realizing we're running out of time. I don't know if you're aware of a 3rd century AD Greek writer called Diogenes Laertius. He wrote a book called The Lives of the Eminent Philosophers. It is one of the primary sources we have for much information that we know of who these men were and what the basis, what their basic ideas were. And of these 80 figures, one of them is inevitably Socrates, although he's not raised up on a big pedestal in Diogenes Laertius. But when Diogenes Laertius introduces Socrates, first of all, he gives the name of his 2 parents and where he was born, Alokippe, which is a district in Athens. And then the first thing he says about Socrates is that he was renowned for being very close to Euripides. It's the very first thing he says in a book on philosophy. And then he gives a number of ancient citations that back him up. So it was clearly, for this guy writing in the 3rd century AD, a long time ago, that was the impression or the image he had of who Socrates was. And we find evidence both in Aristophanes, the comic playwright, and other sources of how Euripides and Socrates were basically buddies. Some of the ancient sources say that Socrates helped Euripides write his plays. I don't think that's probably true. I have a theory as to what his role might have been in those plays, but it does point very strongly to how Socrates was engaging with, you know, probably the most important tragedian of his time. Aristotle later said that Euripides is the greatest tragedian of them all because he shows people how they are rather than how they should be. And in the play Frogs by Aristophanes, you get a lot of, you get another account of Euripides and Socrates that again very much emphasizes this point that Socrates was concerned not with abstract philosophical ideas. He was interested in engaging actual men, unfortunately probably no women, but he would literally collar people. And then he would interrogate them and he would force them to get themselves to think clearly. Now, this to me is very much an engagement with the suffering of those people's lives. They're leading unfulfilled lives. They're just living on automatic pilot. They're living superficial existences. And Socratic inquiry, therefore, is to somehow disrupt that state of comfortable slumber and to wake up to the actual conditions in which you live, which are both moral, ethical questions. How do I lead a good life? But also, how do I enable my life to contribute to the survival of the city, in his case? In other words, what are my social and political responsibilities in this world in which I live? And I think that actually is a much more fleshly, worldly engagement with ethics than you would tend to find in the Buddhist tradition, which tends to think of ethics as somewhat, it's very fine, it's very beautiful, but it doesn't really tackle the nitty-gritty issues of actual human, individual or collective pain, which is very much the case in the tragic drama. And the comic drama too. I think we've got time for just one more.
Thank you so much for this really a marvelous opportunity to dive deeper into ethics and how we live it. I hope your book is a wild success out there. I was reminded of a long ago conversation, actually a Dharma talk that Gil gave on the subject, and he raised Waldorf schools as emblematic. There had been a national study he referenced that pointed to college-age kids that seemed to all coalesce on having come from Waldorf schooling. And as we were speaking later, he conjectured that perhaps this was because of movement and a sense of embodiment that had been carried through their schooling. I wanted to ask whether that embodiment aspect, how that surfaces in your research and your writings, and or personally as you've explored this rich subject. And with great thanks again.
Thank you very much, Betsy. I'm a great admirer of Waldorf education. I don't have children myself, so I've never had to, figure out how to educate them. But I have a number of friends who have sent their kids to Waldorf schools, and I'm very impressed with the outcome. At least the ones I've met. I really do feel that they somehow produce a much more integrated human person that's not an education that doesn't privilege simply academic excellence and ability to pass exams and do all that kind of stuff. Probably not suited. It's probably not suited for everybody, but many of the children who've been educated in that school, I think, have turned out to be wonderful human beings. I do think embodiment is extraordinarily important in our day and age. I think we live in an increasingly cerebral society. And the very fact of a meeting like this, I can see all of you on a computer screen and you can hear me perfectly well, but it's not an embodied encounter at all. It's kind of weirdly intimate and yet at the same time very distant and remote. So, I do worry about how especially younger people today seem to spend most of their time staring at their phones. I worry that might lead to a less vivid sense of our fleshly physical embodiment as human persons. And as I was saying earlier on, I mean, I make art, I write books, and to me this is an embodied activity. It's not just something going on in my head. I do think it's important. And even my daily meditation, sitting cross-legged on a zafu, I think is a very important thing to do. Even if my mind happens to be all over the place that day or I'm half asleep, I still do it. And I think just sitting in that posture actually does stabilize and remind you of a certain posture towards life that is encoded in that posture of, as one sits. So yeah, I'm all for it. And I think, many teachers now include yoga or qigong in their retreats. And I think that's all for the best. I think that's great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. I'm sorry we didn't have time for more. I'm fading a bit. It's 7:30 in the evening and we have guests for dinner tonight. Well, thank you, Rob, very much. And particularly thanks to you, Gil, for the first conversation in many years, which I greatly enjoyed. And I'm also very satisfied that we seem to be very much on the same page, particularly when it comes to ethics. So I wish you all well. And the book comes out in about a month. I've recorded it myself, so you won't have an actor reading it. You'll have me, unfortunately. And I wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, very much. It was a delight for me.
Oh, good. Okay.